Good evening, everyone. I think I got this turned on. Let me see. Yeah, okay, I'm on. Everyone hear me? Good enough? All right. I appreciate Sean did some work, and I've got PowerPoint now. That's it. There's nothing more fancy than that. But it's a title. It's there. All right. We're going to continue this evening looking at the life of David and looking at the time that he spends in what I call his kind of exile period, period where he is more or less on the run for a decent length of time. There's a few key things that we're going to look at that we're going to spend a little bit more time in than others, primarily the moments in which David and Saul interact during this time. If you recall from this morning, or if you recall from perhaps your past knowledge on the life of David, David, after he has killed Goliath, spends some time in Saul's service and goes out and fights the Philistines several times, and there is a kind of escalating difference of viewpoints on each other between David and Saul. Right? Multiple times Saul has tried to take his life, and it got to the point where he decided that he has to flee. He has no other options. That's where we're going to pick up in 1 Samuel chapter 21. I'm not actually going to read much of chapter 21. In fact, I don't think I'm going to read any of it, but I'll just paraphrase, kind of explain what happens here as we go on, so that what happens later on will make a little bit more sense. But in chapter 21, we read that as David flees, he runs to Ahimelech, a priest at, I call it Nob. A lot of these Old Testament names and places of their names of places, I don't have a clue what the proper pronunciation of them are. But he flees there, and he has run without any resources. He arrives, he has nothing really with him. He is hungry, and so he goes to the priest and he says, "Give me food." And all we have are the sacred bread, this special bread that they use as part of their worship to the Lord. And he ends up being able to have some of the bread. And then David says, and David kind of spins a tale to this priest. This priest does not know the full situation. David does not come and say, "I'm running from Saul. Saul's trying to kill me." In fact, David says, "Look, I'm on a mission. It's a super special secret mission, and I had to go really fast. I didn't have any supplies. So do you have food? Do you have any weapons?" And he says, "The only weapon we have here is the sword of Goliath." And David says, "I'll take it." And David heads off from there. While David was there, though, he was seen by a man that I call Doeg. Again, pronunciation's not my specialty. Doeg, the Edomite, who was ahead of the herds of Saul. And so this is going to come into play in just a minute when we look at the events that are going to come up later. But while he's there, after he gets these things, he then decides to run, and he goes and he ends up with the king of Gath. I'm not going to try to pronounce that guy's name. Okay, I'm going to. I can't help it now. Ashish, the king of Gath, right? He shows up there, and this guy said, "Well, aren't you the king? Well, you're the one that's famous for killing tens of thousands. Aren't you the king?" And David gets a little bit spooked by that, and so David begins to act like he's insane to kind of get away out of that situation. And so David is fleeing. He continues to run. He runs from one spot, runs to another spot. And then in chapter 22, we are going to read verses 1 and 2. We read that David departed from there, and he escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. And everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was bitter in soul gathered to him. And he became commander over them, and there were with him about 400 men. And so David goes and he hides in this cave, and his father's household hears about it, and his father's household and his brothers, they come. And along with them, a whole bunch of people who don't have a lot of good things going on in their life. But they come, they're there, right? These are, I guess, the outcasts, right? David's family is almost certainly, right? If Saul has it out for David, if you probably don't want to hang around and see what Saul's going to do to you. They end up taking off. They all gather together, and it ends up that he is in charge of 400 men. And so David has fled from Saul. He has had nothing with him. He goes, he gets some bread, he continues on his journey, gets a weapon, continues on his journey, and he goes and he acts crazy, then he hides in this cave, and at the end of all of these little instances, he ends up having 400 men that are there with him. David then goes to the king of Moab and asks the king of Moab to let his father and his family stay with him while he figures out where he's going to be going. In the meantime, beginning in verse 6 of chapter 22, we read about Saul and his reaction to all these things. It says, "Now Saul heard that David was discovered, and the men who were with him, and who were with him. And Saul was sitting at Gibeah under the tamarisk tree on the height with his spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing about him. And Saul said to his servants who stood about him, 'Hear now, people of Benjamin, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds, that all of you have conspired against me? No one discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. None of you is sorry for me or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait. And as at this day,'" we'll pause there for a second. If you remember, when Saul gets in these moods and he has his spear with him, what happens? That spear goes flying quite often, right? And so I like to try to imagine what it would be like as Saul starts his little rant. And he's already holding his spear, and I imagine the people around him are a little bit nervous, perhaps standing on their tippy toes. I know I would be, trying to figure out which way am I going to dodge if this was sour. But we have here Doeg the Edomite shows up. In verse 9, "Then answered Doeg the Edomite, who stood by the servants of Saul. He says, 'I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech, and the son of Ahitub. And he inquired of the Lord for him, and gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. And the king sent to summon Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's house, the priests who were at Nob, and all of them came to the king. And Saul said, "Hear now, son of Ahitub." And he answered, "Here I am, my lord." And Saul said to him, "Why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, and that you have given him bread and the sword, and have inquired of God for him, so that he has risen against me to lie in wait as to this day?" Then Ahimelech answered him, "And who among all your servants is so faithful as David? Who is the king's son-in-law, the captain over your bodyguard, and honored in your house? Is today the first time that I have inquired of God for him? No. Let not the king impute anything to his servant or all the house of my father, for your servant has known nothing of all this, much or little." And the king said, "You shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's house." And the king said to the guard who stood about him, "Turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David, and they knew that he fled and did not disclose it to me." But the servants of the king would not put out their hand to strike the priests of the Lord. And the king said to Doeg, "You turn and strike the priests." And Doeg the Edomite turned and struck down the priests, and he killed on that day 85 persons who wore the linen ephod. And Nob, the city of the priests, he put to the sword, both man and woman, child and infant, ox, donkey, and sheep, he put to the sword. But one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. You see, Saul's vengeance, Saul's desire to go after David is so great that he kills a priest who did not know that David was even running from Saul. And looking at this, what I see is, it seems obvious to me that the people around Saul recognize that what Saul has commanded to have happen to these priests is wrong. Right? Imagine how wrong a command has to be for the people that are there to guard you, your servants, when you command them to go kill someone as the king of that country. Say no. I'm not going to kill a priest. This is the type of person that Saul has become. In chapter 23, we read about David. David runs off, and beginning in verse 1, it says, "Now they told David, 'Behold, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are robbing the threshing floors.' Therefore David inquired of the Lord, 'Shall I go and attack these Philistines?' And the Lord said to David, 'Go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah.' But David's men said to him, 'Behold, we are afraid here in Judah. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines?' And David inquired of the Lord again, and the Lord answered him, 'Arise, go down to Keilah, for I will give the Philistines into your hand.' And David and his men went to Keilah and fought with the Philistines and brought away their livestock and struck them with a great blow. So David saved the inhabitants of Keilah." I want to point this out because I think it's very interesting to me, right? When David hears about what is going on, the first thing he does is he goes, "God, what should I do? Should I go?" And God says, "Go." Remember, he's got probably at this time roughly 400 men with him, right? 400 people that he's leading, and these 400 men are like, "You sure? You sure we want to here? We're afraid in our own land, and you want us to go fight the Philistines?" And so David inquires of God again. One of the things I think is important for us to recognize about David's character is that David relies upon God. David does not appear to be a person who is rash, at least not at this point in his life, right? He's not a person who is just going to fly off and do something at random without thinking of the consequences at this point in his life. Here he is, and he says, "God, what?" Tells him, and because his people, the people he is leading, are nervous, he asks again. It could have been simple for David to just go, "Look, I already asked. God said go, we're going." And for me, I look at this and I see leadership. You have 400 men who are shaken. 400 men who say, "We're already afraid, and you want us to go fight the Philistines?" And so he inquires again. It is very clear that David does not expect to win this battle on the strength of himself and these 400 men that are with him. Right? It is God that he is relying upon. "God, what should I do?" God tells you, "Okay, we're going to go do it." It's part of what David does often while he is in this period of exile. As we move on, we see that we're going to skip over a little bit here, but basically Saul hears where David's at. He hears he's hiding in this area, he's hiding in that area, and Saul begins to go after him and send people after him. And we have in chapter 24 the first instance of this interaction between David and Saul, direct interaction between the two of them after David has fled and kind of entered this period of exile. So beginning in chapter 24, verse 1, it says, "When Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, 'Behold, David is in the wilderness in En-gedi.' Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all of Israel, and he went to seek David and his men in front of the wild goats rocks. And he came to the shepherds by the way where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts of the cave. And the men of David said to him, 'Here is the day of which the Lord said to you, Behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it shall seem good to you.' Then David arose and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's robe, and afterwards David's heart struck him, because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. He said to his men, 'The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed.' And so David persuaded his men with these words, and they did not permit them to attack Saul. And Saul rose up and left the cave and went on his way." We have here a golden opportunity. We see, Saul is right at this moment, he's got 3,000 men hunting him down, right? Hunting down David. But Saul has tried to kill him on multiple occasions. Twice he's thrown spears at him, tried to impale him on the wall while David was there doing his job with Saul. Multiple times Saul has conspired to try to set traps for David. When it came to giving his daughter in marriage to David, he even used that as an opportunity to try to kill David. And yet, here is presented to David an opportunity to kill Saul. And what I think is interesting is the viewpoints that we see here. Right? David's men see this and they say, look, God has given him to you. Like, we're hiding in this cave and he chooses this cave to come in and relieve himself? God has blessed you. God has given you your enemy. Go, now is your opportunity. End this now. Instead, David approaches and cuts off a piece of his clothing. And it seems to me that David, even after cutting off that piece, just cutting off that piece of clothing is something that David seems to look at and say, I don't know if I should have done that. And again, what's his reasoning? His reasoning is, look, Saul was appointed by God as the king of Israel. I'm not going to strike my hand against him. How dare I do that? Beginning in verse 8, afterward David also arose and went out of the cave, and he called after Saul, my lord, the king. And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the earth and paid homage. And David said to Saul, why do you listen to the words of the men who say, behold, David seeks your harm? Behold, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord gave you today into my hand in the cave. And some told me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not put out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand? For by the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, you may know and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hands. I have not sinned against you, though you hunt my life to take it. May the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me against you, but my hand shall not be against you. As the Proverbs of the ancients says, out of the wicked comes wickedness, but my hand shall not be against you. After whom has the king of Israel come out? After whom do you pursue? After a dead dog, after a flea? May the Lord therefore be judge and give sentence between me and you, and see to it and plead my cause and deliver me from your hand. It's a brave moment. All right, Saul, who again multiple times tried to kill him. Saul, who has 1,000 men hunting him down, and David steps out after him and delivers this speech and says, look, I could have killed you and I didn't. How much more proof do you need that I am not against you? That because you are the Lord's anointed, I will not strike out against you. I will not put my hands against you. But David also says something else here that I think is important for us to understand, because David does not believe that what Saul is doing is right. But instead of passing that judgment himself, David says, let God be the judge between the two of us. Right? You've wronged me here. You have chased me away from my home. You have made me flee. But I am not going to be the one who judges between us. Let God be the one who judges between us. Let God be the one who avenges me for what you have done. But I will not raise my hand. Verse 16, as soon as David had finished speaking these words to Saul, Saul said, is this your voice, my son David? And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. And he said to David, you are more righteous than I, for you have repaid me good, whereas I have repaid you evil. And you have declared this day how you have dealt well with me, and that you did not kill me when the Lord put me into your hands. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safe? So may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day. And now behold, I know that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Swear to me, therefore, by the Lord, that you will not cut off my offspring after me, that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house. And David swore this to Saul. Then Saul went home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. It'd be a great story, right, if that was the moment of redemption between these. Right? Hey, everything's good. You've proven that you're not really after me, right? Saul goes back home, and David, in his wisdom, says, we're going to stay in our strongholds over here, right? David, maybe he's like, I've been burned a few too many times with the way that Saul is going to flip back and forth in his motivations and his actions. And so he stays behind. Chapter 25, I'm not going to read a whole lot of it. We'll read just a little bit of it. But what happens is David and his men, one of the things that they had done while they were in this wilderness, while they were in these strongholds, is that they had chosen to protect these workers of a man that went by the name of Nabal. And it just so happens that Nabal is shearing his sheep, and it is a time where there's supposed to be a feast, and David approaches Nabal and says, look, I've protected your people. They haven't lost anything because my men have protected them. Please give some food for this feast. And Nabal says no. Nabal says, oh, the land's filled with people who have ran away from their king, who've turned around. Well, I can't give my food to everybody. No. David gets angry. And David says, you know what, I'm going to go wipe him out. I'm going to kill Nabal. There's not even going to be any of the men left in Nabal's group, Nabal's family. They're all, no, I'm going to go destroy him. And Nabal's wife, a lady named Abigail, hears about this. The servant says, hey, this is what happened. Right? The servant says, look, David and his men have done nothing wrong to us. They've treated us well. They've protected us. Because of them, we have lost nothing. And this is how Nabal responded, and she recognizes that that's not the way that he should have responded, and she goes out and offers him a gift. Eventually, shortly after this, her husband dies, and we pick up in verse 40. And when the servants of David came to Abigail at Carmel, they said to her, David has sent us to you to take you to him as his wife. And she rose and bowed with her face to the ground and said, behold, your handmaid is a servant to wash the feet of the servants of my Lord. And Abigail hurried and rose and mounted a donkey, and her 5 young women attended her, and she followed the messengers of David and became his wife. David also took Ahinoam of Jezreel, and both of them became his wives. Now Saul had given Michal, his daughter, David's wife, to Palti, the son of Laish, who was of Gallim. And so now here we have, at this point in his life, David has at least 3 wives. One of them who has been given by Saul to someone else. And then in chapter 26, we see another encounter because Saul has a group of people come up to him and say, hey, Saul, David is still camping. He's camped out over here. Now's a good time to go get him. And Saul goes, okay, I'm going to go out and go get him. And again, Saul sets out to go after him. We're going to pick it up in beginning in verse 5. And David rose and came to the place where Saul had encamped, and David saw the place where Saul lay, with Abner, the son of Ner, the commander of his army. And Saul was lying within the encampment, while the army was encamped around him. And David said to Ahimelech the Hittite, and to Joab's brother Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, who will go down with me into the camp to Saul? And Abishai said, I will go down with you. So David and Abishai went to the army by night, and there lay Saul sleeping with the encampment, with his spear stuck in the ground at his head. And Abner and the army lay around him. Then Abishai said to David, God has given your enemy into your hand this day. Now please let me pin him to the earth with one stroke of the spear. I will not strike him twice. But David said to Abishai, do not destroy him, for who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? And David said, as the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him, or his day will come to die, or he will go down into battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. But take now the spear that is at his head and the jar of water, and let us go. And so David took the spear and the jar of water from Saul's head, and they went away. No man saw it or knew it, nor did any awake, for they were all asleep, because a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen upon them. Here we have another opportunity for David to end this matter. Saul again is hunting him down. Saul again has an army with him. Saul is in fact encamped in the middle of this army. And David, one of his men, sneak down in there, and there they are. Saul is sleeping right there with a spear stuck in the ground by his head. And this man says to David, "Let me strike him." Right? The first time, what did the men encourage him to do? The first time, the men encouraged David, "Go kill him yourself. God has given him to you. Go kill him." But David said, "I will not strike him. I will not do this." This time, this man, this follower of David says, "I will do it." Not only will I do it, this man says, "Look, I'm going to do it humanely. I'm going to do it in such a way where I only stab this dude one time. This man who has constantly tried to kill you, I'm only going to, one stab, that's it, it's over. I put the spear right through him. We're on our way. We're done with this." And look at David's character. Right here, David could more or less, he could say, "Sure, I'm just going to turn around, right? Well, I'm walking away. I don't know what's going to go on. You do what you're going to do. I'm just going to go on," right? He could have done that. He could have said, "I have no responsibility here." Instead, he says, "No." Because how can you strike the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? And instead, he says, "Look, I have faith in God. I know that someday God will avenge me. God will deal with me. Someday Saul will die. He might die of old age. He might go out to battle and die in battle. But Saul is going to die. I will not be the one who strikes him." Not going to be something he does. In verse 13, "And David went over to the other side, and he stood far off on the top of the hill, and with great space between them. And David called to the army and to Abner, the son of Ner, 'Will you not answer, Abner?' Then Abner answered, 'Who are you, and who calls the king?' And David said to Abner, 'Are you not a man who is like you in Israel? Why then have you not kept watch over your lord the king? For one of the people came in to destroy the king your lord. This thing that you have done is not good. As the Lord lives, you deserve to die, because you have not kept watch over your Lord, the Lord's anointed. And now see where the king's spear is and the jar of water that was at his head.'" Verse 17, Saul recognized David's voice and said, "Is that your voice, my son David?" And David said, "It is my voice, my lord, O king." And he said, "Why does my lord pursue after his servant? For what have I done? What evil is on my hands? Now therefore let my lord the king hear the word of his servant. If it is the Lord who has stirred you up against me, may he accept an offering. But if it is men, may they be cursed before the Lord. For they have driven me out this day, and I should have no share in the heritage of the Lord, saying, 'Go serve other gods.' Now therefore let not my blood fall on the earth away from the presence of the Lord. For the king of Israel has come out to seek a single flea, like one who hunts a partridge in the mountains." And Saul said, "I have sinned. Return, my son David, for I will no more do you harm, because my life was precious in your eyes this day. Behold, I have acted foolishly, and have made a great mistake." And David answered and said, "Here is the spear, O king. Let one of the young men come over and take it. The Lord rewards every man for his righteousness and his faithfulness. For the Lord gave you into my hand today, and I would not put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. Behold, as your life was precious this day in my sight, so may my life be precious in the sight of the Lord, and may he deliver me out of all tribulation." And Saul said to David, "Blessed be you, my son David. You will do many things and will succeed in them." And so David went his way, and Saul returned to his place. David taunts and is mad at the person who was supposed to be guarding Saul, because the person who's supposed to be guarding Saul failed miserably in preventing David and his man from going up there and taking that spear. David again says, "Look, you're the Lord's anointed. I'm not against you. I haven't done anything against you." And Saul again recognizes that this is true. and they go their separate ways again. This time in verse 20 or chapter 27 tells us that David runs away, and instead of just running into the wilderness in Judah, he runs and he goes to the land of the Philistines. Chapter 27, verses 8 through 12. Now David and his men went up and made raids against the Jeshurites, the Jerizzites, and the Amalekites. For these were the inhabitants of the land from old, as far as Shur to the land of Egypt. And David would strike the land and would leave neither man nor woman alive, but would take away the sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, and the camels, and the garments, and come back to Achish. And when Achish asked, "Where have you made a raid today?" David would say, "Against the Negeb of Judah, against the Negeb of the Jerahmeelites, or against the Negeb of the Kenites." And David would leave neither man nor woman alive to bring news to Gath, thinking, lest they should tell about us and say, "So David has done." Such was his custom all the while he lived in the country of the Philistines. And Achish trusted David, thinking, "He has made himself an utter stench to his people Israel. Therefore he shall always be my servant." So David runs, and he runs to this Philistine who allows him to live. And then while he was there, David and his men, they go on these raids, and they attack people who have been enemies of the people of God since the time they came out of Egypt. And he goes on raids, and he takes things from them, and he brings them back, and the king, this Achish says, "Well, where'd you get this?" And David says, "Well, I went back, the people of Judah, they're against me now." And this man says, "Well, look, man, he's made it. No one's going to like David anymore. He'll be my servant forever." The Philistines decide to go to war again against Saul and the Israelites. And in chapter 28, this interesting thing happens. While David has been on the run, Samuel has died. And Saul is trying to find out what's going to happen with this battle with the Philistines. How's this going to go? But he can't find anyone who can help him. Small wonder, right? The man who's killing priests, burning entire cities to the ground because they helped David. They didn't know that David was an enemy of Saul at the time, right? Has a hard time finding someone to approach God on his behalf. And through a series of events that are interesting and odd in verse 28, essentially Saul is able to talk to the spirit of Samuel. So chapter 28, beginning in verse 15, and Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" And Saul answered, "I am in great distress, for the Philistines are warring against me, and God has turned away from me, and answers me no more, either by prophets or by dreams. Therefore I have summoned you to tell me what I shall do." And Samuel said, "Why then do you ask me? Since the Lord has turned from you and become your enemy, the Lord has done to you as he spoke by me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor David, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not carry out his fierce wrath against Amalek. Therefore the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will give Israel also with you into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons shall be with me. The Lord will give the army of Israel also into the hand of the Philistines." Chapter 29 talks about how David is called by this Achish, who he has been living in his lands, and told, "Hey, you're going to come with me to go against war, or go to war against the Israelites." And when he gets there, the rest of the Philistines look at him and go, "David? Dude who killed Goliath? Dude who's killed literally thousands of us? You want us to go to war with him by our side?" I said, "No, that's not going to happen. Because what if we go to war and he joins up with the Israelites, and then send him back." And so he's sent back in chapter 29. And in chapter 30, we read about David going back to the city of Ziklag, which is where him and his men were camping. And beginning in verse 1, it says, "Now when David and his men came to Ziklag, on the third day the Amalekites had a raid against Negeb and against Ziklag, and they had overthrown Ziklag and burned it with fire, and taken captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great. They killed no one, but carried them off and went their way. And when David and his men came to the city, they found it burned with fire, and their wives and the sons and daughters taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep. David's 2 wives also had been taken captive, Abinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and his daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. David returns back after being rejected to go fight. He'd been called by Achish to go fight. He was going to go do it. He returns back to the city where they had made their encampment, had lived, and he finds that the city has been burned. And that all the women, all the people who are there have been carried off into captivity by this group of people who had come after them. And they are all greatly distressed. But verse 6, David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. What happens is David and his men pursue this band of people who have come and gone out against him. And it gets to a point where the men are so tired that some of them can't go on anymore. And so a group of them stay behind with their belongings, and the rest of them continue the chase. And God delivers them. Right? God delivers this group of people to David. David overtakes them. David takes everything back that was lost. And he comes back, and these group of men who had gone on to continue the fight, they say to these people who were just guarding the luggage, guarding the stuff, said, no, you don't get any of the spoils. You can have your wife and your children, but you get nothing else. And David says, no. And he implements a rule that continued on throughout the kingdom of Israel. David said, when we go to war, the people who are guarding the stuff get their share of all the spoils. The person who stays behind to guard things gets the same spoils as the people who are going to go out and fight. Chapter 31 of 1 Samuel talks about how Saul dies. Saul ends up falling on his own spear after his army has been completely demolished by the Philistines. And then if we turn to 2 Samuel chapter 1, the last bit we'll read today, we read about David's reaction to the death of Saul. 2 Samuel chapter 1. We'll start in verse 5. And David said to the young man who told him, how do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead? And the young man who told him said, by chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear, and behold, the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him. And when he looked behind him, he saw me and called to me, and I answered, here I am. And he said to me, who are you? And I answered him, I am an Amalekite. And he said to me, stand beside me and kill me, for anguish has seized me. Still lingered beside him, and I killed him, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. Now I took the crown that was on his head and the armlet that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to my Lord. And David took hold of his clothes, and he tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. And they mourned, and they wept, and they fasted until evening for Saul, and for Jonathan his son, and for the people of the Lord, and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. And David said to the young man who told him, where do you come from? And he answered, I am the son of a sojourner, an Amalekite. And David said to him, how is it that you were not afraid to put out your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? And David called one of the young men and said, go, execute him. And he struck him down so that he died. And David said to him, your blood be on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed. The enemy of David, or at least that's what Saul put himself to be, right? Saul, who hunted him down, tried to kill him on multiple occasions, chased him away from his home, gave his wife to someone else, finally dies in. And this man who delivers the news, who is less than honest in the way that he presents the story. If you go back and read into 1 Samuel, you'll see what I mean. But he says, I did it. I know he's dead. You to lift a hand against the Lord's anointed. David wouldn't. And David says, you deserve to die. Your own mouth has testified that you have gone against the Lord's anointed. I don't know about you. When I think about David's time in exile and these times where he has an opportunity to kill Saul and he doesn't because of the position that Saul holds, the position that God had given him, David has great respect for Saul because God appointed him king. And David says, I will not go against God. Be honest with you. If someone tried to kill me once, I think I'd have a hard time really mourning their passing. If someone tried to kill me twice, I might even celebrate their passing. Someone tried to kill me twice, chased me out of my home, gave my wife to someone else, continued to hunt me down for years and years, died, I might throw a feast. But you look at the nature of David. David says, this man was appointed by God. How sad it is. How much should we mourn when God's anointed perishes? David has a great respect for God and the will of God and what God has appointed. And the question is, do we? I'll freely admit what I'm about to say is a little bit of a stretch. All right, so feel free to say, Ryan, don't think we can really get that from this story. But one of the things that I think is interesting, one of the things that this has made me think of as I've prepared for this sermon is how often people reject the church because of a bad experience they had with a member of the church on an occasion or maybe even multiple occasions. And I think about that, and I think about David refusing to strike out against the Lord's anointed, refusing to go against that. Because he says, God has appointed this. I'm not going to go against it. And yet it's so easy, and we see it so often, people leaving the church, the kingdom that God has established, because someone had wronged him. I very much doubt anyone in our lives, anyone involved in the church, has wronged us as much as Saul wronged David. And yet David's respect for God said, I will respect that establishment. I will respect what God has established. And so I guess I want to end on this encouragement. As you look at David's life, and as we continue the next opportunity that I have to preach, and we continue to look at David's life, we'll see that David is not a perfect individual, that David makes many mistakes, that David does things that are questionable, things that we would certainly not hope to have us do or someone we know do. But David has a high respect for the Lord and counts on the Lord when he messes up. He counts on the Lord when he is weak. He counts on the Lord when he is strong. He always is concerned about the will of God. So I want to be concerned about the Lord. If you have a brother or a sister in Christ that perhaps you have wronged or perhaps you feel they have wronged you, I want to encourage you to reach out to that individual at some point. Man, if David can out to Saul, if David can wrath that Saul so rightly deserved, surely we can reach out to our fellow Christian brother or sister who has wronged us and try to repair that relationship so that we're not wandering in the wilderness away from the kingdom that God has established. If there's anything that we can do to encourage you tonight, we ask that you come as we stand and we sing.